Today, it's been an interesting day, and not just because it's the eve of spring 2017, and not just because you and I are in a lair, or really a secret lair, of Volvos somewhere in the Phoenix Valley of the Sun, but it's been a day of firsts because it's the first time you and I are looking at a Polestar together. And as part of that process, I met the head of R&D for Polestar, Henrik, and it turns out after we went through the whole deep dive of the car together, I looked at the owner's manual for some light reading during lunch, and it turns out Henrik himself signs all the owner's manuals of every Polestar. So with that, I think you and I should look at the engine. Before we open up the hood here, a bit of a trick on Volvos. The hood release, it's always a bit of cat and mouse when you're looking at new cars, but Volvo has a neat trick here in that they put the hood release at the top of this diagonal spine here through the grille. So you just follow the spine to the top, search for it somewhere in here, and boom, it opens. Now, the engine. This really is the changes from 2016 to 2017. So let's start with kind of the basics. When you and I first looked at what they call the 90 cluster, the XC, then we looked at the Vs and the S's at the same time, Volvo has taken the decision to go with an all four-cylinder strategy. Whether you agree with it or not, they're doing it. So they've decided to cascade that idea down the line here, even before this 60 cluster goes to the scalable product architecture. So what that means is the 2-liter, 4-cylinder direct injected engine makes its way here. So that means that the 3-liter, 6-cylinder goes away. And what have they done to make this overpower a 6-cylinder engine? Well, they've done a lot. It is supercharged and turbocharged like this engine here. But that's pretty much where the similarities end. So they've taken the turbocharger from this and thrown it in the trash. They've put a bigger turbocharger here. So that one's, the impeller is 60 millimeters, this is 64 millimeters. So that makes you look at other changes to make up for the bigger turbocharger. So what does it turns out in output? Well, the output is 362 horsepower, which comes in at a relatively aggressive engine speed of 6,000 RPM. The torque, 347 pound-feet of torque, which comes in anywhere between 3,100 RPM and stays flat all the way to 5,100 RPM. Follow me thus far. There's still more changes. So when you have a bigger turbocharger, that usually means turbo lag. So they had to change a couple of things here. Remember, supercharger from here. So the supercharger works from 0 to 3,250 RPM, and then above 3,250 RPM, the turbocharger takes off. Now, this is interesting in that the turbocharger doesn't stop at some engine speed. It can go all the way up to the max engine speed of 7,200 RPM, all based on load. Now let's put that aside. You've got that extra turbocharger, basically the bigger turbocharger. How do you get boost out of it? Well, you actually lower the compression ratio. So the compression ratio over here is 10.3. This was put down to 8.6, and the way they did that was to shorten the connecting rods. They're 2.2 mils shorter. Follow me thus far? Then you've got a whole bunch of changes in terms of the exhaust. The exhaust on, I don't want to say that one, but let's call the V60 and the S60 the R line. Let's call it the baseline. That has a 2.2-inch diameter exhaust. This has a 3-inch diameter exhaust, so less back pressure. Let's put that aside. Then they've made some other changes in terms of structure. So you've got all this extra power, and it kind of gives you a basis of comparison. The base that we're calling the V and the S60R, that's 302 horsepower. And the car that this replaces, remember that 6-cylinder that is a liter bigger, that was 347 horsepower. So there's still more power. You need some additions in terms of structure. So this carbon fiber on the strut tower, this is carried over from the 2016 car. But wait, there's still more. The intake and the exhaust valve springs have been changed. The fuel pump has been changed. Now that came about primarily because of the change in the turbocharger and the compression ratio, so now the fuel pump is higher pressure. Then there's the air intake. This primarily is the same as the serial production car, the 302 horsepower car. But what they found was it starts here, goes around the back of the engine, does an abrupt U-turn, goes into the turbocharger. But then they found there was an indentation that restricted airflow, something you don't want in a turbocharged car. Well, they asked the engineers at Volvo, and they're like, well, we do it because of manufacturing. So they had to go to the manufacturing folks, and they found out when you marry the engine into the body, there are all these fuel lines and everything, and to make room for that during manufacturing, there was this indentation in the air intake. Well, you can imagine the guys at Polestar, like Henrik, like, well, can we change this somehow? So they sat down, they had like a Geneva Convention of sorts in Sweden, and they came up with a new air intake in the back, so there's no restriction. That was a lot. Now let's move on to driving dynamics. Here there aren't as many changes as underneath the hood, but there are important changes. So you know how we talk about a Haldex all-wheel drive system in the Golf R episodes or the Audi S3 episode. This technically is a Haldex all-wheel drive system, but Haldex has been acquired by BorgWarner, so now it's BorgWarner. Now, the Polestar engineers have made some engineering changes. So in the Volkswagen and the Audi, it could send up to 50% of the power to the rear wheels. This can be 50% of the power at all times, and that's in Sport and Sport Plus modes. We will cover that in the full first drive review, how those two work, and the significant difference between the two. Now, let's put aside the all-wheel drive system. There's the transmission. So remember, in this cluster of cars, it was an 8-speed automatic transmission. This also is 8-speed automatic, but now the Polestar engineers have made the shifts faster, and there are obviously paddle shifters on this one, not in the T8 over there. Then there are the wheels, 20 inches. And what's interesting, Henrik, he's got a very, very strong personality on rubber. Specifically, all-season tires are verboten on his car, to the point where in the owner's manual it says all-season tires are not permitted. I mean, even if you own the car, they're just not permitted. So there are 4 different rubber options on offer. There's this, the summer tire, and then there's 3 different winter tires on offer. I mean, this comes from Sweden, so you can imagine, very serious about that. Then there are the brakes. In the front, 371 millimeter diameter rotors that are slotted and vented. The calipers, 4-piston Brembo here. Moving to the back, it's the same 1-piston caliper from the R design car. Then all the way around, the pads are a higher compound, basically a higher performance compound. Then think about it, it's about, what, 20% more horsepower than the R design car, so you need to improve the overall structure, whether it's a wagon or a sedan. They do that a couple of different ways. The stabilizer bars, they're 15% stiffer. The dampers, all I'm gonna say here in this episode, they're adjustable. In the full first drive review, I will show you how to adjust them, but overall, they're about 80% stiffer. Okay, I think that is all of the laundry list of changes from 16 to 17. Now let's take a quick look at the interior, because there's one thing, okay, 2 things I need to point out. Do you remember when we drove both the XC60 as well as the V60 cross country in one of my most favorite places on this planet, Vail, Colorado? Well, the interior here is virtually no different. There's basically color and trim differences. For example, the dash has this like faux, I think it's faux carbon fiber. There's blue stitching on the shift boot as well as the seats. And then any color you want as long as it's black. The biggest difference are the seats. Now, I've driven this car long distance here in Arizona as well as on a track here in Arizona. And the seats, like on the road, they're champs like any other Volvo. But what works on the road is exactly what doesn't work on the track. There's like this bolstering that's not enough, and it's in all the wrong places on the track. And then they've got this like this color and trim here. There's leather here, but then it's like a nubuck, they call it. Really, it's faux suede. That works, but it's just the bolstering, not so much. Okay, I think that's everything on the inside. Now, the last thing you and I need to cover today is the business of Polestar. And if I'm honest, even in a car-crazy place like Los Angeles, I don't see many of these, and there's a reason for that. They don't make many. And Polestar as a business didn't start until 1995, and at that was only race cars. And it wasn't until 2014 that they started making road cars, and those were only sold in Australia. They sold 50 wagons, 50 sedans, and then 2015 they also sold 50 wagons, 50 sedans, but that included North America. Then in 2016 they upped it to 750 cars. Now in 2017 they're talking about 47 countries and 1,500 cars. So still not a whole hell of a lot of cars. So with that, I'm not really going to leave you with a question, but leave you with colors. So when I do see these, they're only in this color. It's called Rebel Blue. And here's a fun fact I'm going to give you. The 42% of the sales of these vehicles are in this one color. So that's probably the reason why you see it only in this color. So with that, I'm going to leave you with a very specific question, and that is to those, let's do the math, 950 people that own these things. If you are watching this, what do you do with your Polestar? Do you drive it every day? Do you put the rugrats in the back? Or do you take it to track days? Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all one word, MotoManTV all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, I want to leave you with two things. Number one, make sure you download our fancy updated application. Oh, and by the way, subscribe and hit notifications on YouTube. And then number two, I want to leave you with a fun fact. So you don't see many of these, but when you do, you usually see it in this color. It's called Rebel Blue. And the makeup is almost 50% of the one color. Specifically, it's just over 42%. Until I see you for the full first drive review, where we take this station wagon on a racetrack, bis später.